As passengers settled into their luxurious first-class seats, anticipating a smooth and peaceful flight, an unexpected drama unfolded. A man exuding arrogance chose to humiliate a fellow traveler, oblivious to the mistake he was making. His smug confidence quickly faded as the situation took an unpredictable course. By the time he realized who he had challenged, it was already too late. Every eye in the cabin was on him, witnessing his downfall. The boarding gate for the early morning flight from Las Vegas to Los Angeles swung open, welcoming passengers who were eager to get on with their journey. First-class passengers were ushered into a sleek, spotless vehicle that would transport to the plane. The air was a little quiet, the kind of calm that comes with 6 in the morning, as if the world was still rubbing sleep from its eyes. Amongst the tiredness, a man who looked in his mid-40s stood out with his expensive, handmade Italian suit and polished leather shoes that shone on each step. He was a venture capitalist who takes pride in what he does. Judging from his business aura, Tony wasn't entering the plane for some get-together. He had a startup that interested him. He was also on the plane to assert his superiority and dominance regarding wealth and riches. However, he had no idea he was about to meet someone who exuded a much greater superiority than himself. As Tony walked into the comfortable first-class cabin, he quickly found his seat and sank into the soft, buttery leather, feeling its luxury wrap around him. Without paying much attention to anything else, he took out his tablet and began scrolling through his emails, hoping to find something interesting. After a few minutes, he turned off the tablet and stretched his neck. That's when he noticed a tall, strong-looking man with a small bag walking into the cabin. The man's size stood out, and he seemed to have an air of confidence as he entered the space. Little did he know it was NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal, also known as Big Shaq. Tony eyed the man with a look of disdain, as if questioning whether he had wandered into the wrong section of the plane. His outfit certainly didn't scream first class. There were no designer clothes or flashy accessories. Instead, the man wore a simple hoodie, athletic pants, and oversized headphones draped around his neck. Yet, despite his casual appearance, there was a certain calmness about him, an air of someone who had lived enough to remain unfazed by the small disruptions around him. Who is this man? Tony thought to himself, his gaze filled with judgment. He doesn't seem like someone who belongs here. What's a poor black man doing in a place like this? A flight attendant approached and directed the man to his seat. Without a hint of concern, the man adjusted his hoodie, stowed his bag above, and glanced out the window as the plane began to ascend. The view outside was nothing short of stunning. Inside the first-class cabin, plush leather seats, chilled champagne, and an air of exclusivity set the tone. It was the kind of luxury that often brings out the best, or the worst, in people. And Tony was on the verge of showing the latter. Big Shaq, seated in the same row, exuded an easy confidence. His calm demeanor suggested he was completely unaffected by his surroundings. From the moment Tony laid eyes on Shaq, his disdain was clear. He had made up his mind to make the big man uncomfortable, a decision he would regret deeply. Turning his head slightly toward Shaq, Tony made sure his feelings were obvious. To assert his superiority, he flashed his expensive watch, perhaps hoping for a reaction from Shaq, but the man remained unfazed. "Oh, I didn't know they let just anyone into first class these days," Tony said, wearing a smug smile. "First class isn't as exclusive as it used to be." He let out a mocking laugh, louder this time, drawing the attention of nearby passengers who exchanged glances and murmured, though none dared to speak up. Shaq didn't respond. He remained calm, offering only a slight smile before returning his gaze to the window, his hoodie still pulled low over his head. Not willing to let up, Tony tossed out another insult, asking if the flight crew was handing out charity upgrades today, just for people like him. His arrogance spilled over in subtle gestures, dismissive glances in the obvious attempt to dominate. But once again, Shaq didn't bite. His calmness remained unshaken, like an invisible shield protecting him from the negativity. After gazing out the window for a while, Shaq reached into his bag and pulled out a notebook and pen. He was heading to Los Angeles to check on how his restaurant was doing. Recently, he'd heard troubling news about a waiter being rude to customers, and he intended to handle it himself. The stories of such behavior seemed all too real, especially with the kind of treatment he was getting from Tony. As he jotted down his plans for when he arrived, he focused on the task at hand, determined to keep his cool. Tony, however, wasn't letting up. Shaq's lack of response only seemed to challenge him more. Assuming that someone like Shaq, dressed simply and with a demeanor that didn't scream wealth, couldn't possibly afford a first-class ticket, Tony grew more obnoxious. His voice grew louder, drawing even more attention. Did you win the lottery, or do you have a death wish and just wanted to experience a bit of luxury before your time's up? Tony's taunt finally got a reaction from Shaq. Shaq turned his head slowly, giving Tony a cold stare that sent a shiver down Tony's spine. Then, with a calm but firm voice, he said, "Next time you say something like that, make sure you're not sitting next to someone who could dunk on you without leaving his seat." Although Tony's bravado faltered for a moment, the silence that followed Shaq's words was filled with a subtle approval from the other passengers. But Tony wasn't ready to back down just yet. He quickly regained his confidence, determined to continue making the flight uncomfortable for Shaq. "Your ancestors must be proud," Tony sneered. "You're one of millions who finally gets to see what first class looks like." Shaq didn't even flinch. He'd decided to ignore Tony's words completely. Instead, he gave him a brief glance, meeting Tony's gaze for just a moment. Shaq sized up the businessman's arrogance, but remained as composed as ever. With a slight shake of his head, he returned to his writing, blocking out Tony's petty remarks. The calmness in his demeanor was an invisible wall that Tony couldn't penetrate. A young woman who had been quietly listening to Tony's insults couldn't help but cast a disapproving glance his way. Her expression a mix of disbelief and annoyance. An older man, dressed in a sharp suit, looked at Shaq with a pitiful glance, as if silently apologizing for the rudeness unfolding before them. The atmosphere in the cabin thickened, and the tension was palpable. Passengers were beginning to shift in their seats, eager for the plane to land and the uncomfortable encounter to end. Shaq remained silent, and this only seemed to fuel Tony's arrogance. He leaned back in his seat with a smug look, turning to a fellow businessman sitting across the aisle. "I can't imagine wanting to go back to their time," Tony said with a sneer, "where they weren't welcome in places like this, let alone afford it." He paused, casting a glance at Shaq. No wonder they never survived longer than expected. The man across from him shifted uncomfortably, offering a nervous smile, but Tony, oblivious to the discomfort around him, pressed on with his insults. Meanwhile, the flight attendants began to make their rounds, serving drinks and snacks. One flight attendant pushed the beverage cart down the aisle, her bright smile professional as she served the passengers. But when she reached Shaq's row, something in the air changed. Within moments, there was a noticeable change in the way the attendants approached them. Their smiles grew warmer, their service more attentive, and their focus was squarely on Big Shaq. Whispers rippled through the cabin. Some passengers discreetly snapped photos, while others exchanged excited murmurs. Curiosity was getting the best of Tony now. He leaned in slightly, trying to eavesdrop on Shaq's conversation with the flight attendant. "Mr. O'Neill, would you like coffee or tea?" she asked politely. Shaq responded with his trademark calm, "I'd love the coffee, please." At that moment, a thought crossed Tony's mind like a sudden bolt of lightning. Is it the same O'Neill? The legendary NBA star? The big man? No, it couldn't be, he whispered to himself. And then it hit him. He was sitting next to Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend, known not only for his dominance on the court, but also for his larger-than-life personality off it. The realization washed over him, cold and jarring. The flight attendant's words echoed in his mind, each syllable like a thunderclap. Tony's earlier bravado melted away, leaving him visibly uncomfortable. His posture slumped, the smug grin wiped away, and he shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of just how small he had made himself look. The tension in the cabin seemed to reflect his own unease. Tony's face drained of color as the reality hit him. The man he'd been mocking wasn't just a random passenger. He was Shaquille O'Neal, a global icon known for his success, generosity, and humility. The weight of his mistake slammed into him, leaving him speechless. He glanced at Shaq again, but the basketball legend seemed completely unfazed by the whispers now circulating through the cabin. Shaq calmly sipped his coffee, showing no sign of the tension or embarrassment building around Tony. The realization quickly spread through the cabin, but for Tony, it was nothing short of humiliating. "That's Shaquille O'Neal, isn't it?" a woman said, whispering to her husband a few rows back. "Yeah, I think it is," he replied, craning his neck to get a better look. The soft buzz of recognition from those around him only made Tony's embarrassment sharper. Each quiet conversation felt like a spotlight on his foolishness. His hands gripped the armrest tightly, his mind spinning. How could I have missed it? How did I not recognize him sooner? Desperate to make amends, Tony tried to salvage the situation. He leaned towards Shaq, his voice shaky as he attempted to disguise his rudeness with forced compliments. "Excuse me, Mr. O'Neal." Shaq turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Tony's. The look wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't warm either. It was a steady, composed gaze, one that spoke volumes of a life lived with wisdom and quiet strength. "Yes?" Shaq's voice was calm, almost distant. Tony opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? Sorry for being rude? Sorry for not recognizing you? Sorry for treating you like you didn't belong here? None of it felt enough. I didn't realize," he stammered, his words trailing off awkwardly. Shaq raised an eyebrow, waiting. His silence only made Tony's discomfort grow. "I didn't mean to offend you," Tony finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize who you were." For the first time, a flicker of amusement crossed Shaq's face. He set his coffee cup down on the tray table in front of him and leaned back slightly in his seat. "And if I wasn't who you think I am," Shaq asked, his tone measured but sharp, "would that make the way you spoke to me okay?" Shaq tilted his head, his gaze never wavering. He continued speaking. "If I were just some ordinary guy in a hoodie, would that make it okay for you to treat me like I didn't belong here?" Tony's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The question hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment, all he could do was sit there, staring at the man he had so arrogantly dismissed. There was no need for any further confrontation or comments. Shaq's mere presence and the contrast in behavior spoke louder than words ever could. Tony spent the remainder of the flight in reflective silence, his mind undoubtedly replaying every dismissive glance and condescending remark he had spoken out of ignorance and bad attitude. The lesson was clear. Respect should never be conditional. It shouldn't be based on appearances, titles, or assumptions. As the plane descended, Tony felt a familiar jolt as the landing gear deployed. The cabin lights brightened slightly, and the flight attendants made their way through the aisle, checking seatbelts and tray tables. For everyone else, it was just another routine landing. But for Tony, this flight had been anything but ordinary. Many of the passengers from the first-class cabin paused to greet Big Shaq, some sharing quick stories of admiration, others simply expressing gratitude for the inspiration he had provided through his career. However, Tony walked away quietly, carrying a heavy dose of regret. The man who had walked into the cabin, strutting in his immaculate Italian suit, had shrunken, weighed down by the weight of his misjudgments. Bright fluorescent lights and the distant hum of people departing only made him aware there were witnesses to his shallow arrogance, and his humiliation was made public. Finally, he stirred, and a quiet resolve began to grow. After leaving the terminal, he began to saunter, and each then seemed to be a step taken on his own path of self-reinvention. The Los Angeles skyline shimmered outside, lit against the early morning sun, and its lights and reflections melded into a comfortable and inviting mosaic. The city, the vision of ambition and reinvention, was reflected in his. He now had to remake himself radically. As hours went on, Tony twirled around these memories of past encounters, where he stuffed ideas in people, and he blew away emotions if their presence did not conform to the limited shape of the box in which he had placed himself in the past. He had often bragged to himself about his investment acumen and how well he helped startups outsmart their competitors, simply not realizing that each person he passed on his path had their story, difficulties, and successes. Most of it seemed a brittle mask whose arrogance had once fueled his ambition and now cracked as reality hit. If anything, Tony had learned a hard but valuable lesson. Never underestimate, belittle, or look down on anyone because it's a surefire way to end up looking like a fool in the end. What do you think Tony's future would look like from then on? Do you think he has learned his lessons? Comment below with your thoughts. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. See you in the next video.